Welcome to Readability. I'm your host, Ashley Kelson. In Readability, we read all kinds of stories, from short storybooks to large chapter books. You could sit down with family or just lay back and relax. Every Saturday, we read, review, and recommend different books for your listening pleasure. I really hope you enjoy Readability. Let's get started. Hello everyone! Today I'll be revisiting an old mini-series of mine. If you haven't catched up with this little series, make sure to go through my episodes and listen to the Wild Robot by Peter Brown episodes. We're on part 4, which I think is really good for a mini-series like this. So today, I'll be reading the chapters 10 to 14. A lot of chapters to read, but it'll hopefully be worth it in the end. I wonder what we'll learn today in these chapters because the story is really starting to escalate. So I hope you guys are ready because without further ado, let's get on to the read and review. Chapter 10, The Reminder. I should remind you, reader, that Roz had no idea how she'd come to be on the island. She didn't know that she had been built in a factory and then stored in a warehouse before crossing the ocean in a cargo ship. She didn't know that a hurricane had sunk the ship and left her crate floating on the waves for days until it finally washed ashore. She didn't know that she had been accidentally activated by those curious sea otters. As the robot looked out on the island, it had never occurred to her that she might not belong there. As far as Roz knew, she was home. Chapter 11. The Robot Sleeps. Roz stood on the peak and watched the sun sink behind the ocean. She watched shadows slowly spread over the island and up the mountainside. She watched stars come out one by one until the sky was filled with 1,000,000 points of light. It was the first night of the robot's life. She activated her headlights, and suddenly bright shafts of light were beaming out from her eyes and illuminating the whole mountaintop. Too bright, so she dimmed them. Then she turned them off and sat in darkness and listened to the chorus of nighttime chirps. After a while, a robot's computer brain decided it was a good time to conserve energy. So she sat and anchored her hands to the rock. Her non-essential program switched off, and then, in her own way, the robot slept. Chapter 12. The Storm. Roz felt safe up on the mountaintop, so she spent the next few days and nights perched on the peak. But everything changed one afternoon when a low-flying cloud crept up. Roz felt safe on the mountaintop, so she spent the next few days and nights perched on the peak. But everything changed one afternoon when a low-flying cloud crept up onto the mountain and Roz found herself surrounded by white. When the world faded back into view, she noticed more clouds floating south past the island. And then she heard a deep rumble behind her. The robot turned her head around and saw that the sky was filled with a swirling wall of darkness. Light flickered here and there, and more deep rumbles. A storm was approaching, and it wasn't just any storm. It was as fierce as the one that had sent the cargo ship to the ocean floor. The wind picked up, and the first few drops of rain tapped against the robot. It was time to go. Roz unclamped her hand and began sliding down the peak. Hot sparks flew from where her body scraped against the leaning slab of stone. As soon as her feet hit the soil, she was off and running. The rain felt harder, the wind blew faster, the lightning flashed brighter, and the thunder cracked louder. So much rainwater was falling that rushing rivers of runoff started springing up everywhere. Roz splashed down the mountain, searching through the gloom for any kind of shelter. But she should have watched where she was going. Her heavy feet slipped and tripped, and she tumbled right into a mudslide. Our robot was helpless. The river of mud whisked her downhill, slamming her into rocks and dragging her through the bushes and sweeping her straight towards a cliff. Mud was pouring off the cliff like a waterfall. Roz frantically clawed at the ground, grasping for anything she could hold on to. but the flow only carried her faster towards the edge. And just as she was about to plunge over the side, she came to a hard, sudden stop. Mud surged around her, spraying into her face and pinning her against some solid thing. She blindly felt with her hand and recognized the thick roots and trunk of a pine tree. In an instant, she was pulling herself up onto the branches. The wind whipped across the mountainside, and Roz heard the familiar thunk of pine cones pelting her body. But she didn't mind them. She was just happy to be safe from the mud flow. The robot locked her arms and legs around the tree and waited for the storm to blow over. It was the clanging sound when a robot slips on a wet rock. There were quite a few clangs that morning. As Roz worked her way downhill, she scanned the aftermath of the storm. Giant mounds of mud and debris had formed below the cliffs. The island's central river had crested its banks and spilled into the nearby fields and forests. Some trees have been uprooted, others were submerged, their upper branches barely poking above the floodwaters, their lower branches swarming with fish instead of birds. After such a storm, you might expect to see animal corpses scatter along the devastation, but the animals seemed to have survived just fine. Somehow they had known that the storm was coming, and they found shelter long before it rolled in. Lowland creatures who had sought refuge on the higher ground were waiting patiently for the water to recede. Deer were wading through the flooded fields. Beavers were busily collecting the trove of falling branches. Geese honked at the sky before splashing down onto a watery section of the forest. Clearly, the animals were experts at survival. Clearly, the robot was not. Roz was crusted with mud and grit, so she gave herself another good cleaning, but that only revealed her dents and scratches. They were really starting to add up. She had hardly resembled the perfect robot who had appeared on the shore just a week earlier. The wilderness was taking a toll on poor Roz, so she felt something like relief when she spotted a quiet hole in the side of the mountain. It looked like a safe place for a robot. She'd stomped across the hillside, up into the cave, but never stopped to wonder what might be lurking within. Chapter 14. The Bears. Roz stomped into the cave, and then she stomped right back out. "Please stay away," said the robot to the two bears, who were now nipping at her heels. You see, when Roz stomped into the cave, she accidentally woke a brother and sister bear from their morning nap, which is never a good idea. And to make matters worse, bears have an instinct that drives them to attack when a creature runs away, especially if the creature running away is a mysterious, sparkling monster. So, as the startled bears watched Roz stomping out of their cave, they really had no choice at all. They simply had to take up the chase. Roz tried her best to outrun the bears. She leaped over rocks and wove through trees and stomped across the mountainside at full speed. But the bears were young and strong and fast, and the robot had so much to learn about moving through the wilderness. She never even saw the tree root. One moment she was stomping along, the next moment she was flying through the air and thumping down onto a rotten log. Clumps of soft wood stuck to her side as she stood and faced her attackers. Wouldn't you be afraid if two bears were charging at you? Of course you would. Everyone would. Even the robot felt something like fear. Roz was programmed to take care of herself. She was programmed to stay alive. And as the robot watched those bears charging toward her, she knew her life was in serious danger. But the robot's programming would not allow her to be violent. Clearly, Roz was not designed to fight bears. Powerful jaws chomped at her arms, sharp claws slashed her face, and a massive head rammed her chest. "Please, stay away," said the robot. "Roar," said the sister bear. "Grrr," said the brother bear, and the bears went in for the kill. But the robot had vanished. The bears slammed into Roz, knocking her against the trunk of a towering tree. Then one bear drove at her legs, and the other one clawed at her chest. If only the robot had swung her fist or kicked her feet, she would have scared them off. One good bop in the nose would have set them running. Sorry about leaving you on a little cliffhanger. I wasn't expecting that. The next chapter is called The Escape. So, yeah, I hope it'll get everyone ready for what's going to happen next in the next chapters. I think we discovered more about Roz's capabilities and what she can and can't handle. And oh man, I feel bad for her, especially in the storm. And being new to this bizarre environment, as we learned in Chapter 10, The Reminder. I think these weren't super action-packed chapters. Well, except for the storm, really. But they were a very interesting read. For character thoughts, this is going to be short and simple. When talking about characters so far, I'm really talking about any animals Roz encounters. So, the brother and sister bears. I wonder if they're going to make a reappearance when we're farther in the book. They might, but we'll definitely see. And speaking of questions, like I said, will the bears come back later in the book? I know the storm made Roz learn how smart the animals around her are, but did that storm have any other effect on her? What importance was there when Roz enters the cave, except meeting the bears? Will Roz slowly learn more and more about the animals and then adapt to think like them? Because, she's a robot and she adapts. Is there ever going to be a time in the book where Roz will try and be violent? Alrighty, well that'll conclude this week's episode of Readability. It was so much fun reading these chapters and learning more about this very interesting book. I hope you guys enjoyed, and here is our official Readability ending. Thank you for joining me, your host Ashley Kelson, on Readability. It has been a really great time, and I hope you join me again next week. Remember, every Saturday we either read, review, or recommend a book for your listening pleasure. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Keep reading, folks. Bye!